It's an understanding of the real cost and the value of the building and how people react to it, how it supports and delivers that intended functionality. So getting the design right from the beginning is absolutely essential from the outset, but also making sure that we're not being complacent and that we understand that as much as we may consider the design, changes happen and that we need to be vigilant to the way people are actually using the space and how the space can really deliver on that intended function going forward into the future. So why is this? Well, because health and well-being of building occupants is such a powerful influencer on building outcomes and building costs. So today we're going to be discussing exactly that. How do we measure the value of good design and capture that so that when we design buildings, that's not just good at the point of outset when people move in to the buildings, but also in the ongoing life of that space. So today we're going to be discussing it with Mindy Haddin and Cosmin Triclano of the BRE. And I'm going to introduce the subject and then hand over to these two experts. Now, my own design company, Oliver Heath Design, specializes in evidence-based design, and in particular the subject of biophilic design. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we've been writing a series of design guides alongside our partners at Interface, the carpet manufacturers, to help building practitioners, interior designers, and architects understand how they can incorporate health and well-being into the built environment using the WELL standard, using biophilic design, but also looking at how elements of nature can be used to connect people to a sense of space and place, to enhance a sense of community. So all of these 3 design guides can be downloaded, and I'll show you the link for that at the end. So, this is a really important quote. Now, if you can't see it, it says, "Without data, you are just another person with an opinion." Now, for me, this is really, really important. You know, we take an evidence-based approach. Biophilic design is underpinned by 20 to 30 years of evidence and research that demonstrates that the different aspects or the patterns of biophilic design can contribute in a really positive way. Now, this quote is in stark contrast to the way that many of us have ever learned or been taught about architecture or design, where it tends to be more about how we use spaces efficiently, how we connect to site, but also there's a lot of hero worship. You know, we really look at particular design styles and particular proponents of those design styles, and we align ourselves with them, suggesting that if we take one style or another, that we're correct, that we've created a good building. All too often, the success is based on that kind of quite extrinsic approach. It's about an expression of an idea, of an identity, of a sense of power or wealth or corporate identity. But more and more what we're seeing is a movement towards a more evidence-based approach to improve health and well-being, and ultimately to take a more intrinsic approach, to suggest that buildings and spaces aren't necessarily about outward expressions of identity and power, but perhaps more about how those ideas make people in the building feel, how it supports them in the intended activity and functionality, how it helps to improve building outcomes and reduce negative costs. And why is that? Well, because humans cost an awful lot of money and humans are ultimately very unpredictable. Even if you've studied for years and been a practitioner in the built environment, you're never going to predict exactly how somebody is going to be using a building. This chart by the World Green Building Council demonstrates exactly the cost idea behind that. 90% of typical business operating costs are on staff, salaries and benefits. Whereas by contrast, only 1% is in energy use, such as electricity and heating, possibly gas. So clearly, we do need to take a sustainable approach in our carbon consideration and mitigation of that, but also understand the enormous cost associated with human occupation. Looking at how we can mitigate those costs and the negative things like absenteeism and staff turnover, but also how we can improve building outcomes, things like productivity and creativity, and ensure that we've got those ideas exactly right. Now, increasingly, we're understanding that data is all around us. Probably right now, all of you have got some smartphone device in your pocket that is measuring your foot count, the amount of stairs you climb, your fitness, maybe a sleep tracker, Maybe you're wearing some sort of Fitbit. We're all using data to better understand our role and our activity in the built environment. Now Apple have recently launched this new feature. It's a noise warning system that tells you when noise levels have got to a dangerously high level. And you know when Apple have jumped on an idea that it's probably going to be big in the future. And increasingly we're understanding and recognizing the impact that poor indoor air quality can have on concentration, on focus, and on health and well-being. So there are lots of ways that we're starting to measure and understand our reaction to particular spaces and how we should protect ourselves or how we should act if particular warnings go off. Now I mentioned before that my particular focus is on biophilic design. This is an evidence-based approach that helps us to understand our human connection to nature and recognize that when we have an improved connection to nature, it can help us to reduce stress, to aid recuperation, to help us to connect with a sense of place and space, but also the people within that. That ultimately happens through these three areas of biophilic design, which is about improving a connection with real forms of nature, an indirect connection with natural materials, colors, textures, and patterns, but also how we connect with a human spatial response, how we create spaces that are exciting and stimulating and energizing, but also places that allow us to relax and restore and recuperate ourselves. Now, biophilic design is underpinned by 20 to 30 years of evidence and research that for me is an absolute revelation. You know, I studied architecture for 6 or 7 years and never do we have any of this evidence to support how we might evaluate, understand, and take a more positive approach to the design of buildings. So in this particular study where natural light has been improved in education settings, there's an increase in the speed of learning, a reduction in absenteeism, and improved test scores. Quite significant numbers there. In workplace settings, again, when natural features have been applied, there's a reduction in absenteeism of 15%. Office workers were found to perform 10 to 25% better in tests of mental recall and functioning when they had the best possible view over the worst. And an interface study carried out about 4 years ago demonstrated that workplaces with improved levels of greenery and nature connection were found to be 15% more creative, 6% more productive, and 15% higher levels of well-being. So these are really quite amazing numbers that demonstrate that when we improve that connection, we can improve the outcome. In this study in healthcare, again, healthcare recuperation times can be reduced by nearly 10%, post-operative pain care medication reduced by 22%, patients can feel less pain. You know, this kind of world of evidence base is absolutely fascinating and amazing and valuable to every single building typology. Again and again, across every single building typologies, when we consider health and well-being as a fundamental driver for our design ethos, we can reduce costs and improve building outcomes. And of course, as you all know, health and well-being as within the WELL standard is underpinned by a vast body and knowledge base of research that demonstrates again and again how each of the core concepts of the WELL standard is underpinned by this knowledge and makes good financial sense for your clients, it's good for you, it's good for business, and of course, it's good for building occupants. And when we talk about the WELL standard, there is so much knowledge and research there. I mean, if you start to dive into it, it's just like diving into a little rabbit hole of ideas that can inspire the way that we lay out spaces, that we design them, and that we manage them. You know, underpinning the WELL standard, studies such as air quality and better indoor air quality, such as low levels of CO2 and pollutants, and increased ventilation can lead to an 8 to 11% improvement in productivity. When people are more hydrated, can improve their reaction times. Better diet is significantly associated with a 27% reduction in depression. Again and again, there is this vast body of knowledge and research. And that is absolutely amazing. For me, it's fascinating. However, and this is absolutely kind of fundamental to the discussion today, is that this is all research that's happened on other buildings, in other countries, in other locations, of other clients, of other building occupants, probably, almost certainly, in other decades. what's fundamental is that we don't stop here, that we continue this sense of evaluation, that we understand the direct relationship between the things that we're designing, that we're installing into buildings, and how people react to them. So that idea of post-occupancy, pre- and post-occupancy evaluation, it's absolutely fundamental. And I know that it's written into the RIBA plan of works. But I mean, honestly, how many of you here, and I'd like you to put your hands up, have ever been asked about the quality of the environment that you actually work in every day? So put your hands up. Okay, this is making me think that you can't hear, or either that or nobody's been asked. So put your hand up. You put your hand up. Anybody else ever been asked? 2 people, look around you. 2 people in this whole room have ever been asked about the quality of their environment. I mean, you know, we're all in the building industry. Why aren't we asking each other about the sorts of spaces that support activity and the way we want to work and the way we work best? I mean, it's kind of amazing. So, I'd like to introduce you to the BRE Biophilic Office project, a project that has been running for 2 to 3 years now. It's taking a little bit longer to get off the ground than we'd originally hoped. Now, essentially what we're doing is we're taking a whole floor of this existing building at the Building Research Establishment in Watford. It's a 1980s building. It was originally a very energy efficient building. Subsequently, since the point that it was built in the 1980s, it's somewhat languished. Hasn't really been updated or developed. It hasn't had much love and attention to it. So we've had the whole building modelled by a BIM modelling specialist, and essentially we've then undergone an entire year of pre-occupancy evaluation, measuring the quantitative aspects, you know, the things that we can actually measure, like light and sound and air quality, but importantly, and I think this is really important, the qualitative aspects, asking people how they feel in the building. How are they working? Do they feel valued and engaged? Do they feel productive? How do they feel at the end of the day? Are they sleeping well? Have they got a good live-work balance? Now, as a result of that full year of data, we've been redesigning this existing space and rethinking it and subdividing the building into a series of different approaches of biophilic design. Because essentially what we want to do is investigate where the real value of health and well-being can be implemented using this enhanced connection to nature. So you'll see the different color areas here. On the right-hand side, we've got the Wilson area, which is a high level of biophilic design thinking. In the middle, we've got the Keller area, which is an integrated approach. And at the far end, the From area, which is basically the simplest things that you can do to an existing space. Now, for me, one of the interesting things about this project is it's a completely typical project. An existing building, hasn't had any love and attention. Lots of the things that we're doing here can be done to almost every building in the country to find a way to improve it, to cut costs and improve building outcomes. So these are some of the concepts that we've come up with. This is the From area, that low-level design approach. So some of the very simple things about introducing patterns that remind us of nature, introducing pot plants on desks. There's a quick visual. Moving through into the Keller area, which is that integrated approach. So this is like, you know, the sort of simplest things that you can do to an existing space and integrate that into your design process in a refurbishment project. And this is a quick visual. And thirdly, the Wilson area, which is that high-level approach, looking at some of the most cutting-edge materials and technologies of how we can really engage with biophilic design in an artificial way, bringing plants and trees and greenery, water features and acoustic soundscapes into the space to really reduce stress, to aid recuperation, but also to help to connect people, to help innovation. Now, as I mentioned, we've been undertaking this full year of pre-occupancy evaluation. We've been doing this in the quantitative approach, so looking at some of the measurable things that we can do. We've been looking at continuous monitoring of air quality. So we've been looking at temperature, relative humidity, and CO2 levels. So we've been looking at ventilation, VOC levels. We've been looking at acoustic environments, so monitoring the acoustic environment outside the building, but also inside, and reverberation times, the background noise, and also the live noise that's coming from the people within the building. And we've been looking at the lighting environments. We've been modeling the lighting environment in the building and integrating that into the BIM model, but also looking at daylighting outside the building, the lighting coming into the building. And we've also got these little tiny daylight monitors that you see the lady on the left-hand side is wearing, the little black disc, monitoring the light that she is actually experiencing. Now, importantly, as I mentioned, we've also been undertaking a full year of quantitative studies, and Mindy's going to tell you a lot more about that in a moment. So we've been undertaking annual, quarterly and monthly studies, looking at delivering psychology questionnaires, physiological biomarkers, so we've been testing cortisol levels, stress level markers, and also productivity measures such as absenteeism, productivity, things that any organisation would typically be capturing. And this qualitative subject research is absolutely fundamental to the results, and it's really fascinating to hear the difference between the things you can measure and what the building sort of technically feels like, and also to hear how people feel about the building, and Mindy's going to reveal some of those results. Now, a lot of what I've been talking about today and what Mindy's going to tell you about is written about in this guide, Creating Positive Spaces by Measuring the Impact of Your Design. You can download this for free at oliverheath.com resources. Mindy's got a few copies here that you can pick up, so if you're lucky, do pick up a copy of that. Basically, we look into the basics of what POE is, pre-occupancy evaluation. We'll look at the business case, so why you might want to get your client involved, how you might prepare for it, how you incorporate it into your design process, what to do with all that data that you'll be collecting, and then looking at some of the case studies where POE has delivered a really positive contribution to the efficient and healthy occupation of that building. So there is an enormous body of information that already demonstrates that health and well-being can positively contribute to how buildings operate, helping to reduce costs and also to improve outcome. But what's really important is that we don't stop there. It's a starting point, one to pique the interest of our clients, to inform how we might want to approach a design process. But we do need to keep exploring, to understanding the impact of what we design in buildings and how it affects occupants in that building in that ongoing stage when the building is being owned and run by clients. We need to carry out pre- and post-occupancy studies and use that data to improve the design of buildings for well-being, for productivity, and our relationship with the wider natural environment. So that essentially, in a nutshell, is my introduction. Now what I'd like to do is to introduce Mindy Haddy, who's going to talk about quantitative or qualitative research, which works best for pre- and post-occupancy evaluation. So Mindy is a chartered occupational psychologist who joined the BRE in 1999. Her work focuses on social aspects of sustainability and the links between the built environment and health and well-being and the behavior of people within it. She has extensive experience in both qualitative and quantitative research methods and in facilitation and consultation techniques. So with that in mind, could you please give Mindy Haddy a big round of applause? Thank you very much.
Hello everybody, thanks for coming. Can you all hear me? It's a bit strange because I'm talking to you with your earphones on. Thanks Oliver for the introduction. As he said, I'm Mindy Haddy, I'm an occupational psychologist. When he said, joined BRE more than 20 years ago, I can't believe it, I was a baby at the time. And most of my work's been focusing on the impact of the building and the built environment in general on people, on the people that live in it, that work in it, that earn in it, that learn in it, that everything. And often we tend to think about buildings discretely, or parts of buildings discretely, rather than looking at them as a whole. And POE and PPOE is a tool that we use, and I lead on POE and BRE with a bigger team, to actually try to learn what these impacts are, what works, what doesn't work, and gathering evidence, just as Oliver was talking about. And we've worked with Oliver for quite a long time on some of these projects, which I'll talk about. So first of all, I don't like this term POE, pre-POE, so post-occupancy evaluation, but it seems to have sort of embedded itself both in the UK and abroad in history, and it's really something that's quite difficult to change. A lot of people call it building performance reviews, but I think we should have a competition if anyone can think of a much better term. A more business-focused term is what I would prefer. Just a little tiny bit about BRE. I assume a lot of you have heard of BRE. We've been going nearly 100 years now. We were actually the world's first building science centre, and you can see the difference between the top photograph and the bottom one, I hope. We were privatised. We're owned by a charity called the BRE Trust, and all the money from in that charity goes to fund education, research and teaching in the built environment, so professorships and PhDs, etc. at universities in the UK and abroad. We do research, products, tools, training, standard. You'll all have heard of BREEAM, which is our big family of tools, but we do a lot of other things as well. And our aim, excuse me, is building a better world together, which is, again, I think that PPOE is a way of doing that. Okay, Oliver's talked to you quite a lot about how do we design a workplace that has a positive impact on health, well-being and productivity. It's not an easy thing to do. We have a lot of evidence, but it's not always easy to translate that into practice. If you're translating a lab study, for instance, into an actual building. So how do we know we're getting it right? How do we know what works and we should do again, what doesn't work and we should change? So pre and post occupancy evaluation, it actually measures performance throughout a building's life cycle. It's gathering feedback for feeding forward. So you can see this sort of usual cycle that we would start with measuring a building in use. Then if you're looking at a new building, okay, go into using that information to inform the brief, the design, your handover, and then you would measure again. And it's like a scientific method using action research. So we're always drummed into us how to do it, that you have to measure at the beginning, then do your intervention, then come and measure again to look at what impacts it's had. But we do very little of it. I wasn't surprised when Oliver asked how many of you have been asked about the building. Very, very few. And I mean, look at this building around us. I'm sure there's a lot of issues about this. I can certainly think of some, but nobody's going to ask us about it. I don't think so. Maybe they should add some questions. So, as Oliver said, I'll skip over this. We collaborated with Interface and Oliver Heath to develop the new design guide on creating positive spaces by measuring the impact of design. And it explains how to assess how your building is performing using P and POE. As he said, it's in 4 languages actually: English, French, German, and Spanish. You can download it from our website, from Interface, and from our BRE and BRE Trust website if you look for the BRE POE page. And it covers what it is, what it looks like, who else is doing it. So it includes some case studies, including a case study of one of our own offices and how to get started. So POE is fantastic. Why isn't anyone doing it? Why aren't we doing it all the time? And this is really taken from some research that we did when I first joined BRE, and it's still the same today. I went to one of the EDGE debates about 6 months ago, and they were talking about exactly the same things. So we have not moved on in 20 years, even though the RIBA has now put POE back in. It was taken out, now it's back in again. So perhaps that could be a driver, but we'll see. I mean, the barriers, financial barriers, obviously. Who's going to pay for it? Well, if you think of you're going to do it from the very beginning and you put the very small amount that simple POE would cost into your costs at the beginning, it wouldn't be such a financial barrier. Of course, what happens is you finish the building, hand over, suddenly you're going to come up and say, okay, we need another X thousand pounds to do a POE. I don't think the client is always very happy. But if it's something that's planned in from the beginning, then it's not a surprise, just as commissioning isn't a surprise. Opening a can of worms, of course, designers, architects, nobody really wants to know what's happening. They don't want to hear any bad news, but often it's good news. Or if it is bad news, it's something small. It could be a gap in understanding. The FM doesn't know how to run something. The occupants are doing something wrong. So it can be something very simple, but people are worried about that. They're worried about blame and liability concerns. Who's got the time to think about it? The design team has often, they're moving on to the next project. We do have soft landings, again, not used so much. Lack of knowledge and awareness, and I hope our guide will help with that. People don't know what it is, people aren't interested, and they don't know how to do it. But the most important one, I think, is the second one. Whose responsibility is it? Is it the architect? Is it the design team? Is it the developer? Is it the client? And they'll all have excuses. So what I think is that it should be something that the client does, and it should be something they do looking at it as a business benefit. So looking at their building as something that adds value to the business, that it's an asset, not a cost. So many occupying clients, whether it's a landlord or an owner-occupier, sees that building as something separate. But it isn't. It should be an integral part of your business, and it is. So this is something that was taken from the Value Handbook, done by Sebastian Macmillan quite a long time ago. But it's quite interesting. So it's looking at that, it's turning it on its head a bit. It's saying, okay, how does a building add value? So exchange value, that's obvious. How much is it going to be worth? What are the rental value? What's the rental rates I can get from this building? And we know from talking to people that things like BREEAM and things like even looking at WELL and giving people evidence perhaps that this building has improved people's well-being, that it's improved their productivity, isn't that a good selling point for a building? Use value, how does it contribute to the building's profitability, the business's competitiveness? The image value, how it looks. I mean, so many times you go to buildings and people say they're embarrassed for clients to come in. You know, I don't want anyone to come into our building, it's awful, it's too hot, it's too cold, it looks terrible. No, then you'll see it sometimes afterwards and they've completely turned it round, that people are wanting to have meetings in their building because they like it so much. Social value, the building encourages social interaction, social identity, the glue that keeps people within a company. Environmental value, so sustainability, use of natural resources, energy, water, and the cultural value. So that's, again, something that's a little bit unspoken, but how do you use your building to create a sense of place, identity? Then, from a business point of view, you would need to measure the impact. So when a business is doing a different kind of intervention, developing a new product, they would not do that without then measuring it before and after. Right, how has it improved our business performance? And I argue that this should be done with the building as well. And looking at the business objectives, I always go in and I say, okay, right, what were your objectives to go for this building or this big refurbishment in the first place? So they will come up with things. I look at the business plans, things that, well, we want to reduce running costs, we want to improve our staff health and well-being, improve the building stock. We've got like multi-million-pound backlog maintenance, we can't afford it anymore, increase productivity, add capacity. We want a low-carbon building, we want to improve our client satisfaction. And then you need to develop those KPIs based on those business objectives. So using pre-occupation occupancy evaluation to agree objectives, outcomes and KPIs, and have those as your starting measures. But select measures and metrics that are going to be realistic. Don't say, oh, we're just going to want happier staff, we want a more sustainable building, we want clients that are happier, but we haven't got any measures. So you need to find some measures pre and actually try and measure those pre before you can then say, okay, we've made a difference. I've seen some KPIs set that we will increase staff satisfaction by 20%, but they've never measured it, so how are you going to do that in the first place? And then use post-occupancy evaluation to measure impact. I also, you need to use more than one data collection methodology to minimize bias, but it doesn't have to be complicated, and it's really important. You must involve a wide variety of stakeholders at all levels, not just board, because everybody has an interest in success. All your occupants, all your staff want a good building. They don't want to sabotage it, so it's in their interest as well. In fact, I used to do DQI. I don't know if any of you had any experience with DQI, design quality indicators, and it's not used very much, but we used it a lot in schools, and we used to sit down with, again, a mixed group, including pupils, teachers, non-teaching staff, and take them through from the briefing stage all the way through to in use. And it was really valuable because they all had a say, and I think they got a much better building because of that. So how do we collect the data? I know the title of my talk was about quantitative and qualitative methods, which are better, but you need to use them both. So what are quantitative methods? Quantitative methods produce numerical data, tell you what, when, And it could be a questionnaire because you're having tick boxes in a questionnaire which you're using, you're doing statistical analysis, or it could be energy data, it could be data on temperature and CO2, etc. And qualitative methods produce non-numerical text-based information which actually explain why and how, and they're both important. So for instance, I always say people lie in questionnaires, and they do. Sometimes they don't understand the question, but sometimes they want to give you a socially acceptable response. And I find people find it much more difficult to lie when they're talking to you in an interview or in a focus group. And also they're not able to explain. So we often ask a question in homes, how easy do you find it to control your heating? And people will say yes. But when you actually delve down, you found that the way they're controlling the heating is not the most efficient. They'll turn it off. They don't use the timer. They will then get up at 6 in the morning to turn it on again and go back to bed for an hour. Turn it off again. Not the best way to do it, but you wouldn't know that without delving down. Same with health and safety. People might complain that something's dangerous, but you need to find why. I had an instance where it was a retailer, grocer. They had a walk-in freezer. They'd put in movement sensors, PIRs, so that the lights would go off automatically. But they put them at the front, so people were working at the back of the freezer and the lights were going off. So nobody had actually flagged this, but we flagged it by talking to people. So not the same as objective and subjective data. Objective data is what you get from measuring, using, monitoring and etc., like energy and financial data. Subjective data is data that's going through the lens of a person. And that person could be an expert walking around a building. It's still not really objective. Or it's the perceptions of the occupants themselves, which are also very important. Okay, here's just quickly some of the different methodologies. So looking back to your business objectives, using mixture of qualitative and quantitative data, measuring low carbon through your energy and water, through perhaps doing BREEAM. Client satisfaction, you can do questionnaires and interviews with them. They're always very happy to answer questions. Your running costs, your financial data, bills, maintenance, repair costs, staff well-being, so questionnaires, focus groups, and then looking, as I think Oliver mentioned, looking at HR data, so absenteeism, turnover, and how productive people are, testing the indoor environment. Productivity, looking at the business performance data, and capacity. You can do space audits to see if there's enough space and enough space for the future. And of course, building stock and fabric and services through condition surveys, again, physical testing and monitoring, and looking at your maintenance records and complaints log. Just a quick mention of a POE we've finished quite recently. It was in a Great Ormond Street Hospital, so good on them for seeing the value of doing a POE. They're doing a lot of building, spending a lot of money, and they want to see how well it's working. And using that benefits data analysis relating back to their business objectives. Obviously, in a hospital, business objectives slightly different from an office. So you're looking at length of stay, infection rates, what's very important in hospitals, slips, trips and falls. So, or staff satisfaction, turnover. So all these things, they developed KPIs and we reviewed those. We had a space utilization analysis, reviewed the MEP, mechanical, electric and plumbing services performance, got patient, staff and family feedback, and a very important, the most important, is the feedback from the FM and estates team, because they know a lot about the building. Okay. On the other end of the scale, which is more, as Oliver said, more of a scientific study, but again, it's using action research, it's looking we're measuring pre, and then an intervention, and then measuring post, is the biophilic office, and I've been running the occupant feedback side of that, working with technical staff, for instance, like Cosmin from our lighting team, our HVAC team, acoustics. So we measured indoor air quality, and most of it was okay, and most VOCs were attributable to occupants. So occupants' products, the products they're using, perfumes, etc., food and drink. Temperature and humidity was okay. Baseline CO2 monitoring, as you expect, starts okay, and then builds up during the day and declines overnight. Acoustics were fine, but when there were higher noise levels, it was generally linked to office activities, and there were these noise levels were very low, the unoccupied noise levels, which can actually cause more disturbance because you don't have any background noise. Sorry. Lighting, daylighting was very good, but the lighting itself was a bit below CIBSE recommended standards. But the main issues that we have come up with were the issues from the occupant survey. So the majority rated the overall look and feel as poor. 70% wouldn't be happy to show their clients and colleagues their office, and also there's an instability with the temperature. So with the interventions, we're going to obviously improve that. So this is just what do we aspire to. We think POE is the difference between a good building and a great building. We want to be aspirational. It's not difficult or expensive. You can start off doing something very small, as you'll see in the publication, and it should be underpinned by research evidence. And just 3 messages to take away. Let's just give it a business focus and persuade business, whether it's an architecture business or the occupying business, that POE is good for them. That you need to look at it as a scientific process, so a measure, an intervention, and a post measure. And when you need to use different kinds of methodologies, so mixed methods, objective and subjective methods. Thank you very much.
Great. Can we go ahead? Thank you very much, Mindy. Okay, so next up we've got Cosmin Ticlano talking about assessing artificial skylights and impacts on well-being and performance. Cosmin is a principal consultant in lighting for the BRE, where he leads and undertakes consultancy and research projects for public and private sector customers into all aspects of electric, lighting and daylighting. Most recent research work has included studies on lighting impacts on health, well-being and performance. Cosmin is a well-accredited AP and a senior teaching fellow at the Bartlett UCL Faculty of the Built Environment. Give a big hand to Cosmin, please.
Right, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I can't hear myself, so I may be shouting, I don't know. Just tell me if I'm shouting. Right, so thank you, Oliver, for the introduction. We have heard about, how important good design is for well-being. And we also heard, about measures that we should use to assess the quality of the indoor environment and the impacts on our well-being. We are going to finish off this session with a presentation on a very specific aspect of the indoor environment, which is lighting. And more specifically, this is a study that we completed last year, which was in conjunction with the BRE Biophilic Office project that both Oliver and Mindy talked about earlier. We were commissioned by Coelox, who are one of the core partners in this BRE Biophilic Office project, to carry out this study in what's called the environmental room, which is part of this Biophilic Office project, to look at potential impacts on cognitive performance of office workers. And that's the picture there that you can see. That may look like a skylight, but actually that's artificial skylight. There is no connection to the kind of exterior environment, because this is a first floor office in a 3-story building. So you can't have a skylight there. Some of you may have seen these units, some of you obviously may have not, but they are, I think, one of the most realistic illustrations or simulations of a skylight. It's obviously, this is a picture, it's a different feeling when you're in there. Just before talking about the project itself, I thought it might be helpful to give you a brief introduction into this importance. Why is it important? Why light is important for us or for our well-being? And many research studies have been carried out over the years. The main thing to note here is that this pattern, light and dark pattern, or this cycle, a daily cycle that we have experienced throughout our evolution as a species, is what is the most important for our well-being from a light perspective. And actually, many studies have shown that this pattern of light and dark repeated daily, is one of the most, if not the most important element, which is responsible for in training what's called circadian rhythms, which are those rhythms in our body, approximately 24 hours long. That's why circadians, that's come from circa. And these rhythms are responsible for regulating different functions in our body, like secretion of hormones or body temperature and so on. So this is really essential. And why is that so? How come this pattern of light and dark is important for our health and well-being? And that's because in the eyes we have three main types of photocells. We have rods and cones for vision, but we also have IPRGCs. In short, the longer term is intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which are responsible not for vision but for non-visual effects on our body. And they contain a photopigment called melanopsin, which sends signals to the brains, which in a part which is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, where basically we have this master clock in our body, and this in turn sends signals to all the cells in our body to regulate functions and so on. So it's a very complex mechanism, but the key is light is essential, and actually this pattern of light and dark is very important. This is an illustration of how the workplace has evolved over the centuries. Everything is more or less similar. Technologies have evolved, work patterns have changed slightly, or depending on the type of work. But what's common there is the fact that it's an indoor environment. And gradually over the years we have moved inside quite a lot. So now we spend about 90% of our time indoors. And also what's interesting to note in these pictures is that, if early days there were windows, large glazed areas and so on, this gradually somehow reduced, and we can see in the last two pictures at the bottom that actually there are no windows. So some of us, not all of us, the unlucky ones, let's say, we work in windowless spaces. Look at this. How many roof lights do you see? Only out there. Just going back slightly to the importance of lighting in buildings, most lighting standards, or the conventional lighting standards, deal with vision. So the visual effects. We talk about visual task performance, safety around us, avoiding too little or too much light. All these things are about vision. Some standards have started to look into non-visual effects, like the wellbeing standard and a couple of German standards, but it's still very, very early days in this field. Oliver mentioned daylight, and indeed daylight has lots of positive impacts on our well-being for various reasons. Are all listed there. What I should have mentioned, those IPRGCs, those cells in the eyes, they are most sensitive to blue light, so that blue part of the spectrum. And daylight has lots of blue light in its spectrum, especially the first part of the day. And if you think again of our evolution as a species, these IPRGCs are sensitive to that, and they trigger all those mechanisms in response to this. So daylight is important for that reason. It helps our health, our mood. As Oliver mentioned, in healthcare, lots of studies have shown positive impacts. Shorter average length of stay, less pain medication, and feeling good overall. Also working environments, less stress and better productivity. However, in typical buildings, daylight may not be sufficient to entrain our body clocks because there isn't sufficient level of vertical daylight levels at our eyes. And we may need to compensate that using artificial lighting. And obviously everything nowadays is about LEDs. And LEDs have this advantage that we can manufacture LEDs to produce light in a very narrow area of the spectrum, and including blue light. So if you use blue enriched LEDs, you can use them to help overcome sleep disruption problems, or entrain our body clock or circadian rhythms, or increase alertness in some cases. So we can do that, and a number of technologies exist out there, such as, for example, biodynamic lighting or circadian lighting, or some people call it human-centric light. So variable lighting, electric lighting, that tries to mimic the variation of daylight throughout the day. And the picture with those artificial skylights, which I'm going to talk to you about in the next minutes. And this is this project I mentioned initially. We were supposed to look at the impacts of these artificial skylights in an office setting. And we had two phases. The first phase looked at long-term effects. And for this phase of the study, we used 8 BRE staff members who occupied this room for 2 weeks in total. And basically what you can see there, on the left-hand side, you can see one room, which is the control space, and the other picture, the test room, which is where we used these Coelux artificial skylights. The control room was lit by normal, say, traditional LED panels. And we had these staff members occupying each room for a week. They swapped. The light levels on the desks were 500 lux until 3 o'clock, and then that went down gradually to 300 lux at 5 o'clock. And as Minty mentioned in her presentation, we were helped by Minty and her colleague Lorna Hamilton. So for this social research, using a number of questionnaires and cognitive tests. We also carried out a detailed lighting assessment of the space, as well as environmental monitoring like temperature and humidity, and also we monitored the light levels. That was the first phase, as I mentioned, long-term effects, and some outcomes here. What's important to note is that we didn't note a pattern of difference in cognitive performance between these two rooms, and also no difference in stress scores. So what we can say, although on some measures cognitive performance was better in one room or the other, we can't generalize. Also the sample was very small, 8 people only, so we can't say too much about this. But from well-being or subjective alertness perspective, we noticed that people in the test room, the one using the artificial skylights, reported feeling more alert, more optimistic, enthusiastic, motivated, productive, enthusiastic, and chilled in. So that was in the morning in the test room. These differences disappeared in the afternoon for some reason. Also, sleep patterns. We noticed that the subjects using or working in the test room slept on average 18 minutes longer the previous night than those occupying the control room. So that helped from that perspective. The second phase of the study looked at short-term effects, and in this phase we used almost 160 external people occupying each room for half a day. They swapped at lunchtime. In this case we used 500 lux on the desks. Actually, I should mention that this was only in the test room where the skylights were only on the desks in the, not in the sunny side, because that's where this kind of artificial sunlight hits and the levels are higher. We repeated the same measures, so questionnaires, also these cognitive tests, and the same assessment and environmental monitoring. We can see some differences there. The external people use laptops rather than bigger workstations like staff members, so the space slightly looks different. In short, the findings showed that there were some significant differences in cognitive performance between the rooms, but these were minimal, and they weren't favoring any of these two rooms. We also noticed that these differences were significant in relation to the time of day. So afternoon scores were higher than the morning scores, and obviously this may be explained by repeated practice, so people got better with practice. We also noticed significant difference between the ratings of mood, alertness, and performance, but that's all subjective. So people reporting, feeling better, feeling more alert, and being more productive in the test room with the skylights, and that happened on 9 out of 11 scales. And they also reported, higher alertness using this KSS scale, which is a Karolinska Sleepiness scale. You can see at the bottom a graph showing that. So that was a significant difference. They also reported higher ratings of the environmental conditions in the test room. And this graph here illustrates the answers they gave on average to all those aspects. in terms of self-reported mood, alertness, and performance. So basically, 9 of these were statistically significant as a difference, except for 2 of them, which I believe were calm and able to concentrate. But all the other ones, people felt, say, better and more productive in the test room. Just before I finish, if we just go back to, say, these pictures here, what you can notice, you can obviously see that these skylights, from one angle, they look like artificial luminaires. But if you go underneath, you can still see the blue appearance of the sky. And you can also notice on the opposite kind of wall, so the wall where sunlight is sent, that improves the appearance of the space. So that's why people felt better, because the appearance of the space is different, i.e. better than in the other room. Lighting in the other room was still fine. It was complying with all the standards. I didn't mention, but in both rooms, the vertical light levels were also complying with the well-being recommendation, at least 150 ml at the eyes. So both rooms were kind of, lighting-wise correct, let's say. However, the test room with the lighting, with the skylights, is different. It's not something that you would expect in a typical building, in a typical space. And again, this was a test. It was a research project. In normal projects, say commercial or residential, you would place these skylights closer to the walls so that the sunlight hits the walls and increase the brightness of the overall brightness of the space. So it's something to do with the design and the appearance of the space. And so just to conclude this presentation, daylight is obviously the ideal light source, which is out there, has always been there for us, and we feel best under daylight. Studies have shown that occupants tend to prefer locations in buildings which are closer to windows, and also they prefer the appearance of a daylit space. So a space which appears to be daylit, like for example that room with the skylights, tends to be preferred by people. We have this innate connection with with nature overall. There are some artificial lighting solutions out there which can be used to compensate for the lack of daylight, like these skylights, or as I mentioned, the circadian lighting or biodynamic lighting, or more recently integrative lighting. So lots of terms in this field. However, our study didn't find significant differences for cognitive performance, but we did find that these skylights can help increase mood, alertness, and performance, all subjective, so all self-rated. We also carried out recently another project on this circadian lighting, where we investigated the impacts of variable LED lighting on occupants, again, of an office space. And what we did find, again, was this subjective ratings of alertness. But we also noticed improvements in reaction time, so that's to do with performance. So that may help. However, we don't know enough. We still have to carry out more research to come up with a clear understanding of how lighting, and more particularly electric lighting, can be used to compensate for the lack of daylight, and how to use that, how to control it, so that our health and well-being can benefit from these technologies. That was me. Thank you very much.
So we have some time for questions, if anybody has any questions. We've got headphones on. We've got a roving mic here. So does anybody have a question just to kick off? Do we have one there?
Hi, it's Stephen Marks from Mind Body Building. Great presentation, thanks. Just a quick question on the skylights. I was interested. Does the lighting effect actually move, or is it static? And also tied to that question is, would it make any difference if people actually believed that they were skylights there, so it wasn't in the basement where it wasn't conceivable it could ever be you could have that effect. So I'm just thinking of the difference in people's approach to that.
Yes, thank you for the question. The first one, these skylights that we used, you can dim them, but you can't do other changes. You can't change the color. You can't change, the position of the light in them. However, you can't see in the pictures, but if you're in the space under these units and you walk, say, from one end to another and look at them, you have the feeling that the sun or the sunlight is moving. So if you're in the space and move slightly, you have this dynamic feeling, let's say. But no, they don't change in position. So the beam of sunlight remains in the same place on the wall all day long. And yes, this could be an issue. And this is the reason, or one of the reasons, we reduced the light level in the first phase of the project, where we decreased from 500 to 300 lux. And that was because we did the study in winter, so January, February, and people, at the end of the working day, 4 or 5 o'clock, they went out in, plunge in darkness. So we dimmed that to help them overcome this issue.
I'm going to say those lighting features, the Coalux lights, are so incredibly realistic. When you stand under them for the first time, it actually feels like you can feel the warmth of the sun. I mean, it's so close to it. It's quite weird. There's no heat coming from it. But you're standing up going, am I getting a suntan here? It feels warmer. And obviously that will probably die back, that kind of perception. But it's very convincing.
That is very, very interesting, Oliver, that you mentioned the heat kind of effect.
You said interesting makes it sound a little bit nuts, but
no, really interesting, because we had participants in the study, and they were some of them said that it feels warm, it feels warmer under this light, although obviously it wasn't. There was no heat coming out of those units, but it's just a psychological thing, and.
Turn it on, Tom. It was interesting you said that, because again, this is when we were doing a lot of quantitative data collection, but we were also talking to people, and as you said, what did people know? So when we were asking people about the electric lighting, they got very confused, because a lot of them thought that it was a skylight and it was the real sky, and they could feel the heat, and a lot of them were finding it a bit too bright on the sunny side. And then you could hear them, they were discussing it with us. Oh yes, but there is a staircase, so we know there's a floor on top of this. So they were actually sort of working it out themselves. Yeah, it isn't the sky, but it really looked like the sky. And as Oliver said, I think they're really tremendous. I'd love one in my office.
Any other questions? Whilst we're waiting for another question, I'd like to ask both of you, what role do you think technology has to play in the delivery of your respective fields? So firstly, to Mindy, what role does technology have to play in the delivery of PoE? Increasingly we're wearing sort of trackers. I mentioned that the Apple iWatch is now sort of telling you when the acoustic conditions are too loud. Is that going to kind of keep happening? Are we going to be able to kind of gather more data and feedback about it? It seems like a real missing link currently with a lot of technology that we carry around, that it's not feeding back more about our immediate built environment.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's something as simple as like 20 years ago, we would have all questionnaires, all surveys, all forms, everything was paper, and now we use electronic forms. We'd use polls. Everything that makes it much easier for us, and no data entry. And we have, as you say, we're gathering so much data. There's so much wearable technology out there. For the Biophilic project, where people are wearing Fitbits to measure their heart rates, their sleep patterns. We're using the saliva testing, as Oliver mentioned as well, to look at different kinds of hormones that are secreted, measuring stress hormones. And people like you are probably walking around wearing these things, gathering data all the time. But sometimes we can get a data overload. Yes, there's lots of data out there, but we need to be selective at what is actually going to help us. The other additional issue, which we're always tearing our hair about, is about all the ethics, the data collection, the GDPR issues, which is making that a little bit more difficult now for us. So even if we send a questionnaire out to somebody, in the old days, The fact that you actually responded to that questionnaire was you giving tacit agreement. Now we're being told, no, we have to send out a whole privacy statement, we've got to send out consent forms. So things are getting more difficult, but you can understand why, because there is a lot of data. We've got to be careful. We need to just collect what we need.
And equally, similar sort of question to Cosmin. What role does technology play in the delivery of light? If you think about the natural experience of being outside and being in light, and just think how rich it is from the early morning light and the dewdrops and the amazing experiences we have with sunsets, and then we go into a building and it's sort of like, well, it's on off, and that's it. We expect people to be happy, healthy, functioning. So what role does technology play in not only delivering light, but also as technology gets better, in delivering the right quality of light?
Yes, indeed. That's the main issue. Because light sources have been out there for many, many decades, centuries or almost, starting from a candle. What I think technology nowadays can do is control. So I think that's the main thing. Obviously, we have these technological advances in LED lighting. Most of lighting, the new lighting nowadays is LED. And that's a lot of technology behind, producing those light sources. If you just take them, say, in stages. So lighting, just light sources. You have these LEDs, and some LEDs nowadays you can tailor the spectrum of the light they emit. So some LEDs out there can get closer to daylight spectrum, for example. So whilst others are just conventional light sources like you would use in other technologies. Controls are actually very, very important because they are becoming more and more complex. You have for home lighting, you can have now Alexa, you can play with, you can talk to Alexa to control your lights. And the same for, non-domestic world. Lighting controls are becoming more and more complex, but I think with all these technological advances, there comes problem. How to use those technologies, for the benefit of our health and well-being. And I think this is still something that we have to work on, I think quite a lot in some cases. How many of us, let's say, I know because I work in lighting, and obviously there are some other lighting people here, but how many of the general audience out there are aware of the negative effects of blue light in the evening? Yes, there's been some articles or papers here and there, but we have to work more on these aspects. So I think that's what we have to do. Research, do more and more studies, and disseminating all these issues to the general public.
A question from Veronica.
Have you noticed any behavioural changes in the staff at the centre in terms of, for example, not having sandwiches at their desk but going to a communal space, or going outside during working hours? Have you noticed any difference in behaviours?
I think that's a question for you, Mindy. Are you talking about this project or overall? Oh, about the project.
The lighting project.
The project in Watford, so the actual...
the BRE Biophilic one?
Yes, so the difference between the Wilson room and so forth.
We're only still in the pre-baseline stage, waiting for the intervention, so not yet. But actually that's interesting, because one of the questions we do ask in the baseline was how much time do people spend outside the building, and it was tremendously low. I can't remember offhand, but it was something like about 40% of the people that worked in that office do not go out at all, even at lunchtime. So it's really interesting. Whatever intervention we do, and if we're making the office more pleasant, giving it some biophilic features, hopefully that will improve. Whether we then persuade people to go out more, I don't know. There were quite a lot of interesting things, but it's interesting that the space, as you saw before, they didn't rate the space very highly, but they were still stuck in there. So it's really going to be important to see what changes happen.
Any other questions? Probably got time for one more. One more? Okay. Well, just one final question then. Just as a takeaway for people here, POE is a subject that obviously lots of people know about. We may have learned about it at school and education. We know we should be doing it. How do we get engaged? What's the kind of like, if they walk away here with one thing, what can they do if they've got a project on to engage with the subject of POE? And equally to you, Cosmin, how can people engage with the idea of human-centered lighting to support health and well-being? So first, Mindy.
Well, I think just raising awareness, having a look at our guide. Come on, I'm not taking these home with me, so
Do come and pick
please
one of these
come
up.
and take them. And as I say, you can look on our website. You'll also be able to see a video if you want to hear and see me and Oliver again. So it'll tell you more about it, it'll raise your awareness, and just go and do it. And it can be something as simple as just going, visiting the building. It just amazes me with a lot of designers that they're finished with the project, they then just walk away and don't go back to see the building in use. And when we have gone back with architects, they're really happy to see how well it's being used. But it could just be going in there, chatting to the FM, chatting to a few occupants as you walk around, maybe looking at a bit of, if there are some measurements, if they've got any data there, and just taking it as a very, very simple, and looking at it as CPD for you, development for you, and thinking it as business development as well, because if you're going back to a client, it's going to improve your client relationships as well. They might ask you back to do another project.
Cosmin.
Over to me, thank you. I think, as Mindy mentioned, awareness, raising awareness. And I think because this is so important for all of us, for our health and well-being, if you mention, human-centric, yeah, I have some issues with this term, circadian, biodynamic, and lots of terms in this, but this is for a lighting, perhaps lighting event. Awareness is very important, because if you tell people that the way they expose themselves to light is important for their health and well-being, they more or less suddenly become interested. And we did, I mentioned the other project that we did on circadian lighting, and that was in office space somewhere in Norwich. And those people there, they were not in the lighting world, so they had no ideas about lighting. But they were very, very responsive. I mean, just kind of immediately, got interested and very supportive to take part in the research. And I think that was, that shows something. And they were also interested in, knowing the findings of the study and so on. So I think making people more aware of the importance of light and the overall indoor environment, really. Because yes, we all feel very well outdoors. Ironically, sometimes we want to exclude daylight from the indoor environment for other reasons, but yes.
I've got to say, it always surprises me that some of the things that we know intrinsically in ourselves, being out in nature makes us feel good, natural light makes us feel good, we all love a good sunset, that we sort of expect not everybody to have the same reaction. So I think sometimes just engaging with people's personal experience is really important. From a personal point of view, for me, I use 2 products at home now, which have made a real difference to my sleep and overall health and well-being. So it's a Philips Hue light bulb which changes colour with an app. So at night I change my light bulb, my bedside light, to a deep orange that reminds my brain it's dusk for at least an hour, and it makes a real difference to my ability to go to sleep. And then to wake up I use a Lumi light clock, which wakes you up with colour changing light going from red to orange to yellow, and then at the time the alarm goes off it sort of chirps little sort of bird noises like the dawn chorus, and it wakes me up so much more gently that I'm actually feeling much more alert and able then to go and do some exercise first thing in the morning, which is something I just wasn't really able to do when the blaring alarm clock goes off. So from a personal point of view, I get to sleep better, I wake up more gently, I go and do exercise. It makes me feel better to start the day with a little bit of physical exercise. And I suspect these are things that will probably affect a lot of people in a very positive way if they just start to engage with some of these very easy and accessible products.
Yes, absolutely. There are examples, and what you said is great evidence of these impacts. Obviously, we are all different, but also, similar in some ways. So I think overall we might respond, in a similar way to some extent. And you also mentioned apps, for example, and you also mentioned the wearable devices for monitoring light levels. And I think we will also use them in the other project, and people were very interested in that because that was something tangible. They knew something was being recorded, and you have this connection to the outdoor environment through data. And yeah, we didn't give them the option of accessing the data because that was a research study. But that is available out there. So I think these examples and the waking light that you mentioned, and yeah, Philips Hue is one example as well. But all these have to do. You obviously know very well the mechanisms, but I think again, education is very important because you would want to avoid exposure to blue light again in the evening, particularly, I don't know, if we're talking about children or, the children's room or something like that. So everything has to be done, in a using a holistic approach, let's say.
Great. Okay, well, thank you all very much for the questions as well. If you'd like to give a big round of applause for Cosmin and Mindy. And thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of your time at Future Build.